Since October 7th, there has been a rise in cases of anti-Semitism in Canada. And at the same time, there is a conversation around the different definitions of anti-Semitism. So what is anti-Semitism? And what is the line between anti-Semitism and the criticism of the state of Israel? Here to take us through this complex topic is Ben Baader. He is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Manitoba, specializing in European history and Jewish history. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
And I'm really grateful for you to agreeing to have this conversation with us. Let's start, Ben, with the general definition of anti-Semitism.
Yes, let me give you first a very sort of uncontested, general, basic definition. So one can say anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. So that's very basic and uncontested. A few additional comments. So what is particular about anti-Semitism, classic anti-Semitism, very common, is the idea of a Jews in power, Jewish conspiracy, Jews being allied to the forces of evil, sort of collaborating sort of internationally for some evil purpose. So, and that can be used on, and has been used on from all political sides. So the left, can sort of think or make statements, people on the left, about Jews being, allied to capitalism, sort of promoting capitalism, being sort of a force that promotes capitalism. And on the right, Jews have often been thought as being sort of subversive and socialist and allied with socialism, so on. So, but the underlying concept is the stereotype that Jews sort of plot under the surface for some evil purpose. So that is an important mechanism of anti-Semitism. Something else that is important is that Jews are not imagined as, in anti-Semitic stereotypes as sort of, stupid and capable, but as capable, as smart, well-organized, powerful. Somewhat similar to how Islamophobia works, that Muslims are dangerous and capable and terrorists. So they're not so, the stereotype is that they're too capable rather than not capable enough, or, or not smart enough, or so on. So these are sort of some of the main, traits really of classical anti-Semitism. So maybe moving to a slightly different angle is anti-Semitism is often understood as an eternal, unfounded hatred of Jews. And that's where I, as a historian and as a Jewish historian, have a somewhat different perspective, because anti-Semitic stereotypes are founded in particular historical settings, historical reality. And I'm going to give you just one tiny little example. There's of course, lots one could talk about, and I'm sort of a very reduced tiny little piece. So in medieval Europe, Jews were banned from owning lands, banned from guilds and trades. They were a tiny, tiny, tiny little group in a largely agricultural society, or like overwhelmingly agricultural society, in trade, and then often squeezed into money lending. At a time where, the peasantry, that was really sort of 98% of the population, had almost no access to money. So that's where the stereotype of Jews and money comes from. So it's not, and even at that time, Jews were not necessarily rich, but they had access to money in a way in which, as traders, as this tiny little group that were traders, that really, the peasantry didn't have. So that's where, that is true for other anti-Semitic stereotypes too. So there are historical roots that then, of course, get completely, blown out of proportion, and, the idea that all Jews are rich today and so on. And there's, of course, between the Middle Ages and today, there's a little bit of history also to tell. I can't go into it. And maybe something else also since I'll be talking about my favorite topic, which is history, it's a misconception. The Jews have always been hated and persecuted. So there is in Jewish history long periods of stability, prosperity, and actually for much of European history, certainly Jews way better off than peasantry. So one could say historically Jews were a small, privileged, and vulnerable group. That is compared to the majority of the population, majority or 90, yeah. But often, but then also, but I mean, 19th century Eastern Europe, then increasingly also impoverished, and certainly the Jews who came to Winnipeg, were a very impoverished population. So the current sort of stereotype of all Winnipeg Jews being rich is sort of stunning because that's sort of, I mean, historically, obviously wasn't the case and hasn't been the case. And even today, there's significant Jewish poverty, even though, I mean, there is also a significant Jewish middle class, of course. Enough.
No. I appreciate the historical context, and you did an admirable job kind of encapsulating that in such a short space of time. And it kind of provides the complex backdrop to today. What for you is the current controversy around the definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, so in the past decades, the focus of the debates of what constitutes anti-Semitism has come to center on whether the critique of Zionism, Israeli politics is anti-Semitic or not. And at the center of this debate, there are two definitions of anti-Semitism, both of which have been heavily criticized. I mean, they are really contested. People do not agree on these things. So the first that I like to talk about, and also historically first, is the so-called IRA definition. IRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So this organization formulated the definition in 2016 that is then expanded to the sort of established understanding and politicized definition, and I'm going to say more about this, of course, of anti-Semitism, according to which certain critical statements about Zionism and Israeli politics are anti-Semitic. And certain, I mean, even this definition has, says not all. And what is most problematic or most, has drawn most critique, has been most criticized, most heavily criticized, are some of the examples of that the IRA definition lists as examples of what is anti-Semitic. So in here, let me read maybe the most contested one. So it is anti-Semitic, now comes a quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. I mean, there are all sorts of things with this statement. I mean, first of all, the existence of the state is not of an endeavor. I mean, the founding can be endeavor. So is that what's being meant here? Secondly, there's no, I mean, when you go back to Herzl's Zionism at the turn of the century, there's no doubt that it was embedded in racist and colonial ideas of the time. I mean, that was the time. There was much less sort of awareness, that we have it today, and there was no anti-colonial movement, and et cetera, et cetera. So, so there's no, pointing that out is, I mean, to say that pointing out Herzl's, colonial aspects is anti-Semitic is, I mean, absurd, really. Or is the IRA definition talking about racism in Israel today or in the West Bank? And it's just very unclear. And also, I mean, to discuss whether aspects of racism in the Israeli context today is certainly not. I mean, it's a push to state that this is in itself anti-Semitic. If you talk about the existence or the creation of a state, I mean, Canada. I mean, you can absolutely, argue, and it has been argued, and it's not controversial, that the Canadians, the founding of the Canadian state, the establishment of the Canadian state was a racist endeavor. I mean, these things, they are that's what we talk about today. So it is, I mean, of course, we should be talking about it in the Middle Eastern context too, in the Israeli context. And maybe with this example, I mean, what is possibly the most problematic is the jump, the conclusion that claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. I mean, that's just a jump. I mean, these are not necessarily the logical conclusion of one of the other. So that's, no, it took quite some time to sort of discuss this one example, but that shows you, I mean, why this definition has been, has been considered and has been called vague and problematic, because this example is really problematic.
There's another example that I wanted you to talk about, stated in the IRA definition, which is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, is one of the examples of something as anti-Semitic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Also very problematic. And actually, I want to get back to this later, but maybe just for the moment, I mean, comparing as such is never wrong. It is useful to compare things, as long as you do it in order to learn about both sides that you compare. I mean, I think really what this means, what the statement is addressing, is drawing parallels, stating that Israeli politics are similar to that of Nazis. And that I agree that it's done a lot. I mean, and not only about Israel, all things are constantly compared with, Nazis, the Holocaust, and so that is, I mean, there's an inflation of doing that is problematic. It can be distasteful, or, there's a, should non-Jews do it? Can Jews do it? I mean, but it's very contested, whether this is inherently anti-Semitic.
So that's the IRA definition, right? And I think, and that came first, I think, in 2016, as you mentioned, where out of the 11 examples that it offers as examples of anti-Semitism, 7 of them are cite Israel in those working examples. You talked about a different definition. That's the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which came after the IRA definition.
Yeah, and in many ways, it was a reply, a response. And I think in its introduction, it also says it can be used, it should be used sort of in addition. Yeah, and most of our, maybe to say, it is much clearer and much more scholarly. So the IRA definition really heavily community-driven, and the Jerusalem definition was, or declaration, was created by scholars in 2020. So originally signed by 220, or really of the most distinguished scholars in Jewish studies, Middle Eastern studies, Holocaust history. I mean, today about 350 signatories, but these are not, I mean, they're very mainstream people. This is not something that comes sort of from the radical left, or so as sometimes claimed. So, and much of the Jerusalem Declaration's definition of anti-Semitism is very straightforward and is accepted by all, and actually very close to how I started the conversation about defining anti-Semitism at the beginning of this interview, because I find it useful, and these things are really not controversial. Maybe one thing that's interesting in the Jerusalem Declaration, that it calls out behavior that is not uncommon on the left as anti-Semitic. So it says, for one of the examples here, this is anti-Semitic, and I quote, to hold Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct, or to treat Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel. So that is sort of to lump all Jews, no matter, to sort of assume that all Jews, of course, are sort of acting on behalf of Israel. So that is considered, according to the Jerusalem Declaration, as anti-Semitic. So it's sort of a generalization that they term anti-Semitic. So yeah, and that is also not particularly controversial. So let me sort of cite some of the more controversial what is more controversial about the Jerusalem Declaration. So here, one example, maybe here the quote again: boycott, divestment, and sanctions are commonplace, non-violent forms of political protest against states. In the Israeli case, they are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic. So saying, I mean, basically in and of themselves is important. I mean, so it's, and again, that's where this definition I feel is really precise. I mean, it says, of course, I mean, they're talking about the BDS movement, of course, of course, under the umbrella of the BDS movement and in certain statements and so on, they can absolutely be anti-Semitic. But as a movement of calling for a boycott or for sanctions is not in itself anti-Semitic. So that is of course, that is hugely contested. I mean, that is very, many, there are many people who are absolutely not agreeing with this definition and consider BDS as a whole anti-Semitic.
If you had to summarize the main difference between these two definitions, the IRA definition and the JDA definition of anti-Semitism, what would that be?
Well, I was just trying to do that, but maybe it wasn't summarized enough. I mean, Jerusalem Declaration, more scholarly, more precise. And the big difference, and that's really that's really why these definitions, what they stand for is very, very different approaches to what type of critique of Israel or critique of Israeli politics or critique of Zionism is anti-Semitic or not. So in some way, these two definitions are just sort of stand for, or maybe at the focus of a much more general debate. So they're about this question.
It's a really, I think, important thing for people to read both definitions, and they're quite easy to consume, and I would encourage listeners to do that. What for you, Ben, is the line between anti-Semitism and criticizing the state of Israel?
Yeah, maybe in terms of the definitions, absolutely, I agree, and they're not long. They're both 2 pages long. So, so this is not a 50-page, they're not 50-page documents.
They're very accessible to read, and I think very helpful.
Yeah, and you can easily Google them. So,
yeah.
So where's the line between anti-Semitism and, and critique of the Israel or Israeli politics? The answer is really that there is no neutral answer. There is no neutral answer to this question. It depends. The answer depends on where you stand politically. So if you want to answer that question in a scholarly manner, it makes, most sense to say what type of critique of Israel and Israeli politics is considered anti-Semitic and what not is an issue of political contestation. It's pure politics. So, but to not skirt the question completely that way, I think it's useful to understand a little more background. So basically, 20 years ago, the scholarly and political consensus was much closer to the definition of anti-Semitism in the Jerusalem Declaration. I mean, not that there was a time where everyone always agreed, but sort of it's very much, I mean, there has been sort of a shift in the past decade, really, when the community-driven IRA has engaged in extensive lobbying. Since then, a number of institutions and governments, including the Canadian government, have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism.
And the government of Manitoba.
Oh, yeah, that too. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and in some ways, it's never clear what that means, adopted. And the definition it says it's not a non-legal binding definition. So, I mean, in some way, it's, I'm not sure it's not legally relevant, but it is sort of symbolically, of course, important. And I don't think there has, and it's certainly, I mean, it's part of this larger contestation. So, but maybe going beyond these definitions, really, in the course of the past years, Jewish institutions, Jewish organizations, the B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League in the US, Jewish federations of Canada, have really come to consider all critique of Zionism and Israeli politics as anti-Semitic. So never mind, sort of the caveats of the IRA definition. So, and then of course with the terrible escalation of the situation in the Middle East since October 7th, the accusation of anti-Semitism has become a way of defending the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, after the massacres. So critique of how Israel leads the war in Gaza is considered anti-Semitic no matter what by many Jewish institutions. I mean, I think it's fair to say this. And this has been called the weaponization of anti-Semitism, where anti-Semitism and the charge of anti-Semitism becomes a political, tool, really. There's just no doubt about this. And I think also it's reasonable to talk about this trend of towards a definition of anti-Semitism that equals all anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism as a politicization. So that's why, as I said in the introductory, I think it is fair to say that the IRA definition is part of this larger movement of a politicized definition of anti-Semitism. And it's a development of the past decade or so. So, and maybe one more comment also about this. The politicized charge of anti-Semitism lines itself up with the current assault on the liberal university system, liberal and free press. So you can also, argue the other way around, that, particularly in the US it's most clear conservative forces use the charge of anti-Semitism in their ongoing, an assault that had been in the making before the liberal university system and the free press. So that is, so there is also a larger political context. So that there is a North American context beyond the, the war in the Middle East.
Why do you think the IRA definition resonates so much with some
there's one more thing that I need to squeeze in here. That is, this disagreement is a political disagreement. There are Jews and non-Jews on both sides. This is not Jews against non-Jews. There are Jews, Jewish students have been in the encampments. There's a significant, and that's, what I wanted to talk about, if, we had a little more time, about the comparison between, Israeli politics and Nazi politics. There's a long history of Jews doing that. There's sort of some outrageous examples. Here, whatever, sort of this Ruben Moskowitz in 2010, Holocaust survivor said, what I went through during the Holocaust is what the besieged Palestinian children in Gaza are going through. This is a typical sort of inflationary using of Holocaust references. But if a non-Jew was going to say something similar, or is it anti-Semitic? That's very problematic. These are political contestations in Jews and non-Jews on both sides of the fence. Okay, but you wanted to, I know we don't, it's not like a university lecture where I don't have time.
No, I appreciate it. But again, why do you think the IRA definition resonates so much?
It speaks to not only the current situation, but a culture of fear. A culture of fear, history of persecution, history of trauma. So just very, very briefly, there's a background for Jews and Canadian Jewry and of ancestral trauma, of course, most importantly, Shoah, and also history of substantial anti-Semitic discrimination and hostility within Canada. University quotas, restrictions on beaches, real estate were lifted much later. Anti-Semitism really only, anti-Semitism as systematic discrimination only subsided during the rise of multiculturalism in the 1970s. So that is a background. And on this background, the founding of the State of Israel after the Holocaust has played a huge role for the self-esteem, the pride, and the sense of security of Canadian Jews as a group. I mean, that's absolutely fair to say. Many Jews intensely identify with Israel. They believe that Israel guarantees their safety, the safety of diaspora Jewry, and they believe that critique of Israeli politics endangers them, makes them personally unsafe. So, and these Jews conceive, of the identification with Israel as inseparable from religion and their identity as Jews. For them, Zionism equals Judaism. And Zionism has replaced religion. I mean, other Jews push against that, as I just mentioned. I mean, there are Jews with a very strong Jewish identity who are anti-Zionist. But many others, particularly older generation, it's absolutely fair to say most Jews experience critique of Israel and Israeli politics as targeting them as Jews. So they experience critique of Israel as anti-Semitic. So, and these are feelings. And I mean, there can be more to that, and feelings are real. This is just, you can't argue this. That's sort of the emotional, what people experience. At the same time, these feelings go hand in hand with politics. This is not only about emotions. So large segments of the of the organized Jewish world in the diaspora is politically aligned with Zionism and with Israel as a state. So currently, they promote this politics of stand with Israel. So a political sort of solidarity, alignment with Israel, and all critique of Israeli politics and the war, the Israeli campaign in Gaza is considered anti-Israel. I mean, which is absurd because anyway, that's another conversation. there are plenty of Jews who believe in a different type of Israel and Israelis, but anyway. And it's considered anti-Semitic. So critique, it's really, so what I'd like to say maybe, so I talk about like an entanglement of emotions in politics, and they can't be neatly sort of pulled apart, but they both play a huge role. So this emotional attachment to Israel on the background of a history of trauma and persecution, and real politics driven by stakeholders who promote this culture of fear and systematically mobilize loyalty to the state of Israel and the current military campaign.
Ben, thank you for unpacking this for us. And I think it does warrant another conversation around the definition and understanding of Zionism, which is a word that is being used so much. And I think definitely needs some time and space to kind of understand what that means. And I hope you can join us to discuss that.
I'm looking forward, God willing.
Thank you so much, Ben, for your time today.